15, maybe. There you go. Now we know it's being recorded. Maybe we'll wait one more minute if people still join, and then we'll get started. Is that okay, John?
Sure. And then I don't know if you want to, people are going to hear it if they're here already, but if anybody joins, you know, if you want to say that the third paper can't be here, but I could post the executive summary in the chat if people are interested.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone to this session on political parties and employment relations actors. I'm the chair of this session. My name is Maite Tapia, and I'm an associate professor at Michigan State University. First, want to thank John for organizing this great panel, and so thanks for giving me the opportunity to chair it as well. So as John just mentioned, unfortunately, one of the speakers won't be able to make it, and they send their regrets. It's Marick Masters. They couldn't be here, but John is willing to put up the executive summary in the chat in case if people are interested. Okay, so that means that today we'll have two presentations. They'll go a little bit longer given that we just have two, so they'll go for about 18 minutes. So we'll start off with a presentation by Ryan Lamare from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and John Budd from the University of Minnesota. And they'll give us a kind of a comparative longitudinal analysis of political party manifestos and essentially the interlinkages between political actors and industrial relations. And then the second presentation will be by Arianna Tassinari. She's at the Max Planck Institute, and she'll talk about anti-system parties and social concertation in Southern Europe. So I would encourage you to put questions or comments in the chat, and I will gather them. And then after both presentations are done, we can hopefully have a great discussion. So again, thanks, John, for organizing this. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And let's get started. Ryan?
Thanks so much. Just let me just check to see if can you all see that okay? Any issues? Great. So yeah, just to say, you know, thank you so much to Maite and to Arianna for being here, and to all of you for attending the session and hearing this talk. So as Maite said, this is work that John and I have been conducting into political party manifestos and their relationship with work-related ideas. We really welcome any thoughts, comments, questions, or feedback that you might have on this presentation. So let me give just an overall sense of what the direction of this research is going to look at. We're going to focus on political parties in this talk today, and political parties can be thought of as very important, but sometimes to some degree overlooked actors in industrial relations. There's quite a lot of research in the political science arena on the role of political parties, their ideas, and how those ideas might shape different outcomes. But what we don't tend to focus on in industrial relations is the extent to which parties can have deep effects on industrial relations outcomes, and also can have interesting perspectives that they take on worker issues. So we begin our conversation about political parties by thinking about, you know, how they affect IR, and we see them as important players, but often overlooked in this arena. They can affect attitudes toward unions and create different narratives that affect IR state policy choices. And one of the things that we're going to focus on, the key thing we're going to focus on in this presentation, is the political party's election year manifesto. So in any given election year, a party writes a manifesto, and in that manifesto, we think we get to see a sort of pure expression of the party's ideas. We could think of this in some ways as the sort of identity or face that the party expresses to voters and to the wider public and population in its election year sort of sentiment. And so we have 3 examples here of manifestos that you can see. These are all documents that are provided at the party level. The first is the Workers' Party in Singapore, just to give an example. It's a sort of social democratic party. The second is a Turkish political party called İyi, or the Good Party, and it's a sort of a centrist nationalist Turkish party. And quite famously, and something that we'll return to later in the presentation, here's Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party Manifesto of 1979. We think that embedded in these manifestos are important ideas about how parties view industrial relations actors, view labor groups, and view workers. One thing that's neat about looking at manifestos as well is that you get a glimpse at what a party's position is on these issues before they have to make any legislative compromises, before they actually have to govern in any way, before they necessarily have to implement anything. And so we get to see, like I said, this sort of pure vision that the party might have around workers. So what we can look at here within manifestos is the extent to which you see attitudes by these parties that are either in support of or in opposition to unions prior to any sort of end product compromises, and also while accounting for other sort of complicating factors like union density and other items. So we're gonna do a sort of empirical analysis of these. So we're gonna look at the frequency of work-related content and how often that content can be predicted by, or variations in that content can be predicted by certain predictors. And we're going to provide what we hope is a unique lens on the political importance of work ideas. So to give a sense of what the database looks like that we're going to be drawing from, it's the Comparative Manifesto project. And this is a very rich data source. We have over 4,000 party election manifestos. So that's election year party-based manifestos. We see over 1,000 parties that we get to analyze, and we are able to draw from 700 elections. And we're going to look from basically the post-war period to 2019, post-World War II period to 2019. And we're going to be able to look across 54 different countries. So within these manifestos, we'll return to this point a couple of times, but within these manifestos, there are labor positive statements that parties make and labor negative statements that parties make. And those are going to be the sort of crucial things that we're going to examine. You can also see the countries and years in the manifestos, and we get, a huge array of different countries, most of Europe, but we also get North America as well. We get a little bit of Southeast Asia. We got Australia and New Zealand, not very much Africa, but we do get South Africa also. So just to give a sense of the sort of the global reach of the manifesto project that we're going to be drawing from. So how does this coding system work? To understand, what we're going to be examining here, it's important to know, what it sort of, what the process looks like for determining a party's position on worker issues. So what happens is there are country experts in each of those countries that I mentioned, or that you saw on the screen prior, and they will code manifestos in their native languages using parsing into quasi-sentences. And each of the quasi-sentences has a unique idea embedded in it. I'll give you an example of what this looks like in just a second. But basically what happens is these experts take the manifesto, they read it from start to finish, and they divide the manifesto into unique ideas that they then categorize into 56 different categories according to a standardized approach to the categorization scheme. So we're going to look at 2 of these categories, pro-worker and anti-union. But to give you a sense of what this looks like in practice, let's look at the Labour Party's manifesto in New Zealand. So this is the Labour Party manifesto. You can open it to any page, and we'll open it to the page on the economy in this case. And what you'll see is text in the manifesto that starts with, for sustainable growth, we need an economy built on a diverse range of sophisticated jobs-rich exports, and ends with a conversation about KiwiSaver and building a stronger economy. So what experts will do is they will take these 4 paragraphs and they will break them into variety of different categories based on quasi-sentences. So the first two sentences might be classified as focusing positively on technology and infrastructure. The third quasi-sentence, which is sort of a half sentence, focuses on economic growth. The fourth quasi-sentence focuses on labor groups positive, and the fifth quasi-sentence would be classified into economic goals. So the coders are going to take the same scheme, and they're going to go through the manifesto and classify the manifesto according to each of these parameters from start to finish, excluding the preamble of the manifesto. They'll do this for all parties, all elections, all years. Okay, so that's a sort of a general sense of what the sort of classification scheme is going to look like. And we're going to focus on pro-worker, labor positive statements, and labor negative or anti-union statements. And it's important to make a quick note of the distinction between these ideas. Labor positive statements can be quite general in nature. For instance, if we take the US Democratic Party manifesto from 2016, it says, you know, when workers are strong, America is strong. It's a very sort of general statement. It's not necessarily a pro-union statement. It's a good jobs kind of, you know, good, strong workers statement. But pro-worker statements can also be very specific in nature as well. In that same manifesto, we see the Democratic Party saying things like, we will fight to pass laws that direct the NLRB to certify a union if a simple majority of eligible workers will sign valid authorization cards. So pro-worker statements run the gamut from, you know, the vague in general to very specific pro-union labor reforms. Labor negative statements are almost exclusively anti-union in nature. So they are fundamentally going to basically say things like, you know, unions are too strong, there are too many strikes, and we're going to try and implement changes to undo some of the power that unions have. So the Liberal Party Manifesto of Australia, the Conservative Party in Australia in 2013 gives a couple of good examples there of what a negative, you know, anti-union or labor negative statement would look like. And recall, we're going to look at all of these types of statements across all party election manifestos in our data. Okay, so the research questions that we're going to explore here using this content is to look at how important work-related issues are in manifestos, whether we can explain the variation in, you know, why certain parties might have more frequent pro-worker or anti-union ideas in their manifestos, look at whether those variations occur across time and countries, and then finally whether these manifesto ideas affect voting behaviors. So do they get supported or rejected by voters when parties go up for election? So to give a sense, just sort of descriptively, here are the changes in worker-related manifesto mentions over time. The red is pro-worker and blue is anti-union. You can get a sense here that basically pro-worker manifesto ideas remained relatively constant until about the late 1970s or early 1980s. From the early 1980s through about the late 1990s, you see a dramatic decline in pro-worker sentiment by parties in their manifestos. And then from about the early 2000s onward, a significant uptick in pro-worker manifesto mentions. Anti-union mentions are also quite interesting. You see, you know, significantly higher peaks in the early years of the manifesto data, and in particular in the late 1970s and early to mid 1980s, you see a sort of significant climb in anti-union ideas, which then basically flattens out maybe until about the global financial crisis. When you look across countries, you can see significant variation in manifesto ideas across countries. Apologies for the small font here, but you can see significant ideas that are not necessarily connected, or significant variations across countries that are not necessarily connected to one particular ideological system or country-based system or a variety of capitalism. Australia is an interesting example of that variation, where you get a very large degree of pro-worker ideas, but also a very large degree of anti-union ideas in Australia. So in their manifestos, it sort of speaks to like a competition of ideas. Other countries are a little bit less competitive in their positions. There are some countries that have hardly any anti-union ideas in their manifestos. What we tend to see is sort of new democracies and post-Soviet countries don't really focus on work-related issues very heavily, whereas countries like Australia, South Africa, and some of the sort of Western European countries tend to be a little more heavily focused on their pro-worker or labor-related manifesto ideas. Just to give a quick example of how we see manifesto content actually relating to sort of contextual factors. You know, these ideas don't come out of nowhere in manifestos. They are related to sort of the institutional contextual changes that occur in countries. We can do a quick sort of dive into a country like the UK. Now, I've broken this out into 4 discrete periods. And what you see on the right-hand side is the pro-worker mentions by Labor, and on the in red, and anti-union mentions by the Conservatives in blue. Let's take the first case here. So in 1974, you see very high pro-worker mentions in the Labor Party manifesto, and that's largely in response to a lot of deep economic crises and policies from the early 1970s that Labor was blaming on the Conservatives and saying that they were going to address in their manifesto. So that peak is related to an actual contextual event that occurs. A classic example would be of this would be the 1979 Margaret Thatcher manifesto, where you see a massive rise in anti-union mentions, and that rise in anti-union mentions is clearly predicated on events that are occurring around the election, including the winter of discontent, the wave of strikes that occurred in the winter of 1978 and 1979, but also in ideas that were rooted in mid-1970s neoliberal conservative thinking that made its way into Thatcher's manifesto. By 1997, you see in the Tony Blair New Labor manifesto, pro-worker union mentions are basically buried. In fact, they're hidden in a section on education and business growth, and not on any sort of discrete section on worker interests. So they essentially burn their connection to labor in their manifesto. But under the Jeremy Corbyn manifesto in 2017, all of a sudden in the UK, the Labour Party is back centrally focusing on worker issues. And in fact, they have like a rights at work plan that they talk about where they're going to try and introduce sectoral bargaining, and they have a whole section on pro-worker ideas. Okay, so just to get into the empirical analysis relatively quickly here, just want to cover the question as to whether we can identify variation in the presence of these work-related ideas across time between countries and according to different specifications. The answers from our regression results say, yes, we can. So we look at things like party family membership and argue that social democratic parties and other sort of ostensibly left party families are going to have more pro-worker statements and less anti-union statements than conservative parties. We find that to be true. We also find that after accounting for party family membership, if you look at both the mean ideological position of a party, so how far left or right it is, and also its deviation in any given election from its typical left or right position, we see that especially mean party ideology trends toward pro-worker sentiment if you are farther to the left, and also to a small degree, to some degree, your deviation from your mean also connects to pro-worker sentiments. So if you're farther to the left, you're generally more pro-worker. We also look at extremist parties, and we find that far left extremist parties tend to be more pro-worker in their manifestos, but far right parties don't seem to have a significant perspective on worker issues. They are more focused on authoritarianism or nativism, and they don't really deal with unions. We also see that parties' manifesto content is affected by what the competition is doing. So if your competitor in a prior election, if your competitor parties focused on pro-worker issues, then you are also more likely to focus on worker issues in your current manifesto. So there's a sort of strategic components to manifestos. We find also that labor market and economic conditions affect manifesto content. So if you have higher union density and higher inflation, and as well as higher unemployment, we get more pro-worker mentions. And we also find that political systems matter as well. So things like disproportionality in the electoral system and coalitional governance systems, as opposed to single party majority systems, are more likely to result in pro-worker mentions. The last thing just to mention quickly is, do these ideas matter for voters? And the answer is yes. So what we find is that if you have more pro-worker mentions in your manifesto, you're likely to be rewarded with higher vote share and seat share from the electorate. And one question that might occur is like, is this true of all categories? And the answer is no. It's only really true of labor mentions and 6 other manifesto categories that get rewarded by voters. So only 7 to 56 get higher voter seat share, and one of those is pro-worker mentions. So just to wrap up, just to conclude here, we see that political parties are really as being very under-researched as IR actors, and we hope that looking at their manifestos helps bring them into the spotlight. We find that those ideas that are represented in the manifesto are meaningful. They've changed over time. They're affected by different variations in party characteristics, electoral characteristics, and political characteristics. We find that they're rewarded by voters. And the last thing to say is that, something like political systems, we know affects things like individual union membership and union influence, but we are now able to see that things like political systems can also affect worker-related party-level manifesto content. So I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions, and thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Ryan. And there was kind of a multitasking going on. So as you were presenting and doing a great job, John was already also responding to questions. So that's I guess the advantage or maybe disadvantage of doing this over Zoom. No worries, Arianna, we won't expect you to respond on the chat while you're presenting. So we'll wait with asking. You can definitely put them in the chat, but we'll wait with for your response in the Q&A section. So thanks again, Ryan and John. Great paper, great presentation. Let's hear from Arianna. Thank you.
So thank you so much for having me. So this is my first LIRA conference, actually. So I'm very excited to be here as a European-based scholars. This is very exciting to be exposed to different debates. And so I'm going to bring you from the very general and very big picture work that John and Ryan have presented to a very specific approach to the study of political parties in the employment relations arena. So I'm going to be talking about the attitudes that populist parties in power in a specific region of Europe adopt towards social concertation and social partnership with employment relations actors. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background about why does this issue matter? Why should we be caring about this? So in the debate on the evolution of industrial relations in the European context, one of the key issues of concern for IR scholars for the last 30 years has been essentially the role that social concertation plays in the definition of public policies and in the type of interactions that governments establish with employment relations actors. So by social concertation in the literature, it's usually what it usually meant is those processes of policy making where governments choose to share their policy making prerogatives with trade unions and employers organizations and include them explicitly in the processes of policy making by setting up bargaining table and engaging in negotiations over public policy. Now, I appreciate that for a US-based audience, this is not a particularly common phenomenon, but social concertation has been a key feature of employment relations dynamics in many European countries, since the 70s onwards, and has been a key tool for both partisan and technocratic governments to intervene in and steer developments in the employment relations arena. For example, through peak level incomes policy, regulating wage setting across and wage coordination across the economy, but also to negotiate reforms of many issues such as employment protection legislation, the structure of collective bargaining, and regulation of specific workplace issues from part-time work to flexible working and so on. So social concertation has historically been an important device for the governance of employment relations in Europe. However, sort of the common narrative in the literature is that this mode of interaction between governments and employment relations actors has been in decline since the great financial crisis of 2008-2009, especially in those countries within the Eurozone that were most deeply affected by the economic crisis. Why is this seen to be the case? For two main reasons. The first line of argument goes that, over the last 20 years, unions also in Europe have been losing density and legitimacy. And therefore, as a result of this sort of like secular trend in decline of organized labor power, governments no longer really have an incentive to involve organized labor in policymaking, because there's neither particular legitimacy that unions can bring, nor a particular threat of discontent that they can mobilize. And the other argument goes that in the context of a deep economic crisis, such as the Great Recession of 2008-09, governments didn't need to involve employment relations actors in their reform efforts, because they could simply kind of mobilize this crisis narrative to say, well, we need to do these tough measures, we need to implement austerity, and therefore they no longer needed to involve other societal actors such as employment relations actors to legitimize their reform agendas. Now, my PhD dissertation was kind of dedicated to like subjecting this common wisdom to empirical scrutiny. And in my previous work that mostly draws on my PhD thesis, I actually find that the picture is a little bit more complicated, and that even in the context of crisis, governments in various countries of the Eurozone severely hit by the crisis still chose to rely on social concertation at various critical junctures for two main reasons. One was to kind of like project images of responsibility and societal consent to international financial markets and external creditors, basically saying we're all in this together, all the actors in the economy are ready to take the tough decisions, and look, we're going to make an agreement for slashing public sector wages, and we're going to get our house in order. And the second idea, the second reason why they chose to still engage employment relations actors in social concertation was essentially to moderate emerging demands for the reversal of austerity measures and liberalization measures in the moment in which the economy started picking up, and various societal groups that had lost a lot during the crisis period started advancing demands for sort of recuperation of conditions. However, the limit of my previous work is that I solely focus on governments that are either technocratic governments or have a sort of like mainstream partisan orientation. So mainstream governments either of the center-right conservative orientation or the center-left orientation. However, the European political system and party landscape has undergone very deep transformations over the last 10 years, because as a result of the experience of the deep economic crisis of 2008-09, there has been a substantive and significant growth of what in the political science literature is usually called as like either populist or anti-systemic parties. So parties that do not belong in to the traditional mainstream, but that espouse like populist ideologies, either of the radical right or the radical left. And we know very little about what happens to social concertation and to the relationship of employment relations actors when populist parties come to power. So this paper is essentially an attempt to start investigating this question about focusing on populist parties that come to power in some of these troubled Eurozone countries that underwent a deep experience of crisis, and to look at the attitudes that these parties espouse to employment relations actors in general, and specifically to the practice of social concertation and structured involvement of employment relations actors in policymaking when they come in government. So I look at 3 cases: the case of Italy, the case of Spain, and the case of Portugal, and I rely on a mixture of documentary sources as well as elite interviews that I have been conducting, sort of following up on some of my interview research. So this is work in progress. So I'm very happy to take kind of suggestions on how to sharpen also the research design. But essentially, just to give you a brief overview, Italy had sort of like populist government in power in 2019, which was a coalition of a far-right populist party, the Lega, together with the 5-Star Movement, which is a sort of like neither right or left populist parties of like the purest kind. And then Spain and Portugal are a little bit more similar amongst each other in the sense that they had populist parties of the radical left, so Podemos in Spain and the Bloco de Izquierda, left bloc in Portugal, coming to power as minority partners in coalition governments together with the mainstream Social Democratic Party. So now, why would we assume that, like what can we imagine or like kind of expect from the literature about the relationship between populist party and concertation? Essentially, we can expect this to be, if we look at sort of like what the literature tells us about the ideology of populist parties, a rather uneasy relationship. Why? Because the defining features of populist party are these features of people-centrism and anti-elitism. So the rhetoric and ideology of populist parties essentially puts the people, the whole of the people, as the central political actor, and essentially predicates for a sort of unmediated relationship between the people as a whole and the holding of power and of governments. From this attitude of people-centrism derives therefore a certain aversion to intermediation and to the role of intermediary organizations, such as, for example, unions, and a preference for an unmediated relationship between the people as a whole, rather than, for example, a specific class, and political leaders. As a result, populist parties, at least from what we could expect, from the literature, but also from historical experiences, tend to adopt a sort of very critical approach towards employment relations actors, which are seen either as elitist, so it's like kind of like co-opted parts of the broad political elites, as well as representative of sectional or particularistic interests that stand against potentially the interests of the people as a whole, that instead populist parties aim to represent. As a result, processes of structured involvement of these organized groups in the policy process are usually stigmatized as either being untransparent, so it's like kind of like procedurally not legitimate, or undemocratic, because they give a privileged voice to a specific sectional group in society over the will of the people as a whole. So from what we know from the literature, we would expect populist parties in governments to deliberately avoid or marginalize social concertation in policymaking when they come to power. How? In 2 ways, possibly. One could be a direct co-optation and integration of employment relations organizations in sort of like structures of government, so a kind of like Peronist style authoritarian corporatist type of co-optation, or by engaging in sort of competition and marginalization in the policy arena. So either marginalizing issues that matter to these actors, or adopting their agendas and their demands, but without legitimizing employment relations actors as legitimate players in the political arena. However, we might also expect there to be some ideological differences in terms of how populist parties of the radical right or of the radical left engage with social concertation and with employment relations actors as a whole. If we look at exclusionary populist radical right parties, we can expect and also observe from some of the cases that exist, take for example like Hungary under Viktor Orban, sort of ideological aversion specifically to organized labor that can then result in attacks on organized labor's institutionalized role in policymaking. On the contrary, when we look at inclusionary populist parties of the radical left variety, such as, for example, Podemos in Spain, we can see that these parties usually espouse an ideological aversion to institutionalized trade unionism, which they tend to see as, status quo, maintenance oriented, and they tend to instead engage not in a direct undermining of trade unionism, but rather in a sort of like competition, either through like a support of more like sort of social movement unionist type organizations, which are seen as less bureaucratic and with greater role for direct participation of workers, or often by intervening directly through regulation and legislation in the employment relations arena, exactly to bypass the veto powers, for example, of organized employers. However, the point is that these are what we can expect from the sort of like ideological positioning of populist parties, and to some extent also from their manifestos and from what they say when they are not in power. The question is, what happens when these parties effectively come to power? How do they behave? And is there a confluence, or correspondence between what their ideological standpoint would, expect them, how we would expect them to behave, and then what do they actually do when they come to power? So my argument is that populist parties, when they come to power, actually do not, they are less guided by their ideological standpoint, but more by strategic considerations in their decision to engage or not in social concertation and to involve or not employment relations actors. So my argument essentially is that when a party comes to power, the strategy trumps ideology to some extent. And that actually what I claim and try to show in the paper is that populist parties in power actually engage strategically in social concertation, just like any other political party. So either to advance their policy agendas and tame the opposition and hostility of organized producer group, or to gain credibility and ownership in specific policy areas, or they use strategically interactions with either labor or organized employers to maneuver for influence vis-a-vis their coalition partners. So essentially my argument in a nutshell, and the main takeaway point, is that there is a disjuncture between the ideological positioning that populist parties have and how they actually behave when they come to power. Now, I am only really going to have time to walk you through like one of the cases. So this is, I think, an interesting case, is the case of the coalition government between the Five Star Movement in Italy and the Lega government, which was in power between 2018 and 2019 in Italy. So this was a very strange beast because it combined two different kinds of populist parties: the Five Star Movement, which is a sort of like brand of inclusionary populism, which in its manifesto sort of declared hostility towards institutionalized forms of unionism, and had quite a lot actually of what John and Ryan would call pro-worker statements in their manifestos, almost trying to kind of like steal some of the agenda issues of unions, whilst the Lega espouses a much more ideologically hostile approach towards established trade unions and concertation, and whilst at the same time trying to kind of like signal a sort of alliances with a very small right-wing unions as an attempt to kind of like co-opt parts of the labor movement for their ultimately exclusionary and xenophobic policy agenda. So we would expect from both of these parties, for different reasons, non-engagement with the practice of social concertation. But actually what we see when they come to power is that there is a constant sort of oscillation between unilateral legislative interventions on employment relations matter and an instrumental use of consultation-style consultations with the social partners on a number of issues, ranging from regulation of the gig economy, to issues of pensions policy, to issues of regulation of temporary work, and so on. And what I observed through these in-depth case studies is that these two parties actually use social consultation for very different purposes. So in the case of the Five Star Movement, is actually they use social consultation to try and bring unions on their side, because this is a party that is actually has quite a lot of pro-worker policies, and they want to sort of engage in a sort of re-regulation of employment relations. And so they use social consultation as a way to bring unions that are ideologically suspicious of the party, to bring them on side and say, look, we want to do the same things as you. Come to the table, let's discuss, let's do it together. Whilst contrary, in a completely opposite way, the Lega, which is a much more, sort of like neoliberal pro-capital party, uses social concertation strategically to bring employers on board with its agenda and to try and sort of tame and limit the sort of re-regulatory agenda of its coalition party, the Five Star Movement. So overall, what we see is that, first of all, there is engagement with social concertation on part of both parties, which I think it's in itself quite an interesting finding. And this is actually, however, very cosmetic and instrumental and related to the sort of pursuit of power interest. Essentially, parties use concertation and these structured interactions with employment relations actors as a way to kind of gain influence within the coalition and to advance their own policy agenda for strategic purposes. So I'm not going to walk you through the other cases because to some extent, it's way too detailed. But I guess the takeaway point is that there is a very ambiguous relationship between populist parties and social concertation, and I think more broadly relationship with employment relations actors. So on one hand, there is to some extent an ideological aversion to a structured engagement with organized labor and organized employer, but coming to power changes the picture, and there is a much more sort of instrumental approach to social concertation. And if we look at across the different cases, we can see that in various ways and with various shades, populist parties use social concertation when coming to power to make themselves look more acceptable and more reasonable to employment relation actors that might have opposition or be suspicious of them. And so either depending on the ideological brand of populism, they would use it to either tame the opposition of employer organizations or of unions. However, the engagement with social concertation is overall very superficial and subordinated to the pursuit of power interest and influence within the political arena. So it's usually, this practice, there's not a dedication to the practice of social partnership as a value or, as a defining feature of policy making. Rather, it's used instrumentally and then discounted and really becomes an obstacle to achieving specific policy goals. So in this respect, what is interesting, at least for, kind of like the political science side of things, is that we can see that populist parties, when they come to power, they don't actually behave so differently from mainstream parties in terms of this instrumental use of concertation. So obviously, this work has some limitation in the sense that, I only actually look at cases of populist parties in coalition, where, as John and Ryan were saying, the need to craft legislative compromises might dilute some of their sort of ideological orientation, and therefore it might be interesting to study more carefully what do populist parties that are not in a coalition that can kind of like perhaps act with less constraints on their legislative action, whether we might observe a greater correspondence between their ideological orientation and what we could expect at an ideological level and how they actually behave. But for now, I think this is possibly an interesting complement to John and Ryan's paper in terms of like kind of showing how there might be sometimes a disjuncture between what we might expect at an ideological level from parties and then what actually happens when they come to power. So I'm going to stop here and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, this was great, Arianna. Thanks so much for another great presentation. Both of you, really well done. I have some questions, but I want to first give space to the audience. So let's open it up. So feel free to raise your hand or just speak up or put it in the chat, whatever it's easiest.
Can I ask Arianna a question?
Of course.
Arianna, do you see evidence of the populist parties, rhetorically trying to distance themselves from the concertation, or maybe it's being, do they blame the coalition partners for engaging in this to try to be true to their base, as the phrase is these days, or haven't you really seen that?
Shall I respond, or do we want to collect?
Sure, go ahead. As people are still kind of thinking about the questions, I'm guessing. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So this is interesting actually, because there is quite a lot of variation in terms of like this kind of like discursive practices. So what is very interesting is that For example, in the Italian context, they're always very careful to say what we are doing is not social concertation, even though in practice it's exactly the same thing, but they sort of like try to distance themselves from this like brand and this concept, which I guess has kind of become associated with certain features of like the established political system, which they want to distance themselves from. So there is a kind of like discursive distancing, even though the practices remain the same. And this is in the Italian context, where perhaps the legacies of social concertation are much more contested and much more like politically problematic. Whilst in the Spanish and Portuguese cases, what I actually find is that there is almost, when they come to power, an attempt to sort of try to make themselves look respectable by saying, no, look at us, we respect social dialogue, we respect social concertation, we are perfectly reasonable players, you know, and therefore we're going to engage with all the structures just as the other parties do, because we can do government just as the others. So there is quite a lot of differences in this respect. And I think in this regard, the sort of discursive environment that might exist in different countries, as also you and Ryan were sort of alluding to in your paper, might matter a lot in terms of like, you know, how certain concepts, how certain ideas in employment relations arena, such as, for example, social concertation, might be politicized differently, might then shape, you know, the relative incentives to distance themselves or to actually like see, you know, embrace these practices when coming to power.
Thanks, Arianna. Other questions from the audience? Okay, so I have a couple of questions for each of the speakers, I guess. So first for Ryan and John. So when you look at these manifestos, you could think about these as kind of an outcome of the battle of ideas, right? Like who kind of wins behind all these ideas that are out there, the actors that are out there. So if you could pick a country like that you're very familiar with, say UK or New Zealand or US, what are kind of some of these political processes that go on behind kind of the making of this manifesto, and to what extent then, building on what you kind of asked Arianna, to what extent is there kind of a line between these manifestos and what's written, the framing essentially, and the actual actions and the behavior and the strategies that you see? So that's for John and Ryan. And then for Arianna, it's really interesting to look at some of these populist parties like the Lega, the Cinque Stelle, the Five-Star Movement. And it seems like they come in a very kind of traditional structure in which you have this old kind of structure of social concertation, and now you have these new animals that often come from social movements into an institutionalized space. So first off, when you say, you know, they frame themselves or consider themselves anti-elitist, to me, there's always a tension there. When you then actually come into power, are you still kind of anti-elitist, or are you now kind of part of the establishment? And do you become institutionalized? And what does that mean for a movement like Podemos? When you go from the streets into a political party, how can you make that work? And I think, I know also, and you probably know this as well, like Paulo Gerbaudo has done a lot of work on political parties. So that might also be interesting to look at. And I guess my question, I'm not sure if there's a, let me look, not sure if there's a question in there, but as you said, many of these movements are on the left and the right. They have these positions in both camps. So again, in terms of, they're just very different animals. So how can we then reconcile this kind of old structure of social concertation with kind of these new social movement-like beasts that become institutions into an actual government and power? So this might be more of a comment, I guess, or than a question, but feel free to comment to my comment. Thanks. And if there are other questions that we can assemble at this point, feel free to put it in the chat or just speak up or raise your hand if you prefer.
So I'm happy to take on Maite's excellent question, John. You're welcome to obviously jump in as well. So the sort of the mechanisms through which the ideas get formulated, we argue that there are sort of three broad channels that are useful in thinking about how an idea enters into a manifesto. We think that they reflect sort of three sort of discrete things, one being like the entrenched values of the party. Like, if you have a long-standing tradition or party heritage of being, a party that's supportive of worker rights issues or what have you, you're likely to probably, continue over the course of the 60 or 70 years that we have, to reflect that sort of long-standing tradition. So we call that the sort of entrenched values channel. We also argue, though, that there are two other channels that are important to consider. One is the idea of new thinking, which is, even if you have this sort of long history, there are certain party elites that might enter into control of a party that bring with them new ideas. The Thatcher example is a classic one where we can clearly see new thinking emerging based on neoliberal ideas that are percolating in the mid-1970s, and Thatcher takes those ideas and expresses them in the manifesto in a way that prior conservative leaders hadn't done. And then the last channel is what we call reactive mirroring. And the idea of reactive mirroring is essentially that you treat your manifesto as a transactional document, that you think about what the voter might want, and you are there to win power and win seats. And so what you do is you write a manifesto that corresponds to what you perceive the will of the voters to be in any given time period. And so if the voters aren't really interested in worker ideas or are quite anti-union for whatever reason, your manifesto is likely to reflect that sort of strategic imperative that the party has to gain power. So we think those kind of cover the channels, but if there are others that that anyone can think of, that would be really helpful as well.
And I guess just to quickly add to that, we've been seeing the manifesto sort of being presented in the context of a battle for ideas and power over ideas in, competing for influence within the political arena, right? And I think, Maite, I'm interpreting your question, right, sort of backing up one step, right? And like the creation of that can also reflect sort of a battle over ideas and power through ideas. And Ryan and I both being quantitative researchers, we're trying to take a big N approach here and, sort of make our contribution that way. And I think we'd need a much more qualitative approach to dive into those really rich questions. But in terms of, not the battle for the contest for how these ideas emerge, but how they're used. I mean, I think we definitely see, we also have a similar quick little case to the one Ryan presented in the UK for Australia. And you can see a very clear sort of reaction over time where these ideas seem to be, clearly deployed in response to their competitors' ideas in the previous round. But again, that's in that arena rather than within the political party. And the very last thing I'll say is, Ryan did mention we have the sort of long-term ideology as well as deviations from ideology within specific time periods. And our results across the broad set of countries, again, there's lots of nuance that goes on within, but across the broad set of countries, the long-term deviation, the long-term ideology seems to be a more consistent, more robust predictor than the short-term, right? Which would maybe contain clues about the where these ideas are coming from in terms of your question, Maite, but again, very sort of indirectly and speculatively.
But would you say, sorry to do like a quick follow-up, but would you say if you look at the long term, does that then, what is the difference between like the structures that we see IR institutions say have, gone to a neoliberal field over time, and so we would expect there then to be hand in hand kind of these manifestos. So I guess to what extent are the battles, is this battle of idea or the framing or the manifestos, is this driving some of the behavior, or does this come along with the structural changes that we see in those countries going towards a neoliberal dominance?
So maybe we should just say yes and let Arianna have some time. Because I mean, you're doing a really good job of surfacing some of the key issues here, and and we can't tease that apart, and undoubtedly it's complicated, and feedback loops and going in multiple directions, and I think you've articulated that quite well, and we don't have a great response except to acknowledge that that's probably going on.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for taking the space. Arianna.
So I'll respond to Maite's question, and then I'll also throw in a comment for John and Ryan for good measure. So I think your point is very well taken, Maite. I think I'll take 2 points from what you said. I think the first one is that I myself sometimes doubt the analytical value of using the populist label as a kind of catch-all label, when actually what you're looking at is very distinctive types of actors and of parties within it. And it is, I think, to some extent debatable how appropriate, and I'm not sure myself, to what extent does it make sense to equate populist parties of the radical left, which, as you say, come from a tradition like inclusionary social movements, and come to power with a very, very specific and different agenda from far-right populist parties. And so, I actually have some doubts, and like other political scientists do also in the field of populism studies, which is not my field per se, about does it make sense to really look at them together, also because the relationship with social movements is very different, right? And it is to some extent debatable whether radical right parties are as rooted in social movements as for example some of the radical left equivalents. So I'm gonna just take that as a sort of critical point that I apply to my own work too, and perhaps might even lead to some changes in the framing of the paper. And I think absolutely this question of how do you deal with social concertation is a key part, I think, of a broader agenda of inquiry around how do social movement actors behave with established institutions when they suddenly go from being outsiders to at least temporarily insider status. And I think this is rife with strategic puzzling and dilemmas, and how these get resolved, I think, within the organizations is a field of really fascinating study, and whether kind of pragmatist engagement with the available institutions in order to get as much as you can whilst you're in the structures of power, interact with what one might call the entrenched values, and the sort of staying true to your roots and staying true to whatever your anti-elitist politics. And I think what we observe just empirically by the experience of some of these actors coming into power, for example, Podemos in Spain, is that generally the pragmatism route tends to prevail, which to some extent is also, I guess, what you could argue about the Corbyn Labour Party in the UK, right? In the period in which Corbyn was leader. But then that comes potentially with electoral costs in the long run, because then you kind of dilute your identity, and then it's then what makes you different from the sort of mainstream left party. So I think there is a lot of strategic dilemmas, and for unions to some extent, right? It's how do you engage in the structures of collective bargaining when you have a seat at the table, and militancy versus moderation for the sake of staying at the table. I think these are kind of the same dilemmas, and I think there is a lot of, useful potential dialogue across IR and political science in this respect, in terms of how these actors deal with these challenges of being part of, in and against the system, all at the same time, right, to some extent. And I guess it's more of actually a comment or a suggestion for John and Ryan about some other potential channels of ideational change that you might want to consider. So one of them is the potential of there being a mirroring effects across parties, in the same parties and families, but across countries, right? So, there is a big debate in political science about saying, the changes in social democracy, and how, the sort of reorientation of the Labour Party in the late 90s towards the third wave then has a kind of cascading effects also for social democratic parties elsewhere, in Europe, and, German social democracy and then Italian social democracy kind of following this path. And so I don't know if you have a way in which you perhaps could also track through your data, how ideological shifts then in parties of the same parties and families, but elsewhere perhaps have a lagged effect elsewhere. So this kind of transnational diffusion and influencing type effects, I think would be interesting. Obviously, the other obvious one would be a simple like changes in the composition of the social basis of parties, right? So it's like secular decline of the weight of the working class in the context of post-Fordism might also make the relevance of pro-union statements, for example, less relevant, but I don't think you can control for that with your design because you have too many countries and you definitely probably don't have the data on, share of working class voters, but that maybe you could do that for a subsample of countries for which some of this data might be available, just to check whether that might make a difference. And then the last one would be the political attitudes of the electorate. And I think like you could, for example, use again, maybe for a subsample of countries, maybe data from the World Value Survey to look at whether, say, the political attitudes of the electorate towards unions or towards other aspects of labor legislation or whatnot follow or rather precede shifts in parties' ideologies, right? So if you observe a decline in union trust, does that come after ideological shifts in parties, or is it rather parties responding to public opinion changes in a rather instrumental way? So there was just like some suggestions. You don't need to respond, but I just thought I'd throw them in.
Just to say that's super helpful and really useful for us. Yeah, especially that sort of contagion effect idea is really cool. That's something that I think we actually could do in the full data that we could look at. So very much appreciated.
Great. Well, it's just 1:15 now, at least here where I am at. So I want to thank the panelists. These were two excellent presentations, really great work. I hope to see the published papers and read them soon. Really excellent. So thank you so much. Thanks again, John, for organizing this. And nice meeting you, Arianna, and good to see you again, Ryan.
Thanks, Maite. Great job.
Yeah,
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Arianna.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you, guys. See you soon. Thank you, Maite. Bye.
Bye, Arianna.
Bye, everyone. See you soon, Maite.
Bye. 15 minutes.
Hey, Randy, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hey, Randy. Good to see you, man. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly. Do you want to, I think you should have an option to do share screen. Yeah, a little green button. Why don't you just try that and see if you can pull up your presentation?
Yeah, let me try it right now.
Hey, Bernadette. Yep, perfect.
That, and let me just go to slideshow and see what happens.
Steve, did you start that recording or is that left over from the last session?
That's left over from the last session.